there, my name is Dr. Kimberly Ernest, and I'm here with the How to Be Happy Hour with 4 amazing helping professionals as we unpack the stress, burnout, moral injury, and vicarious trauma of the helping professions.
My name is Jeffrey College. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist and professional counselor here with Pennsylvania Counseling Services, also the father of 3 kids under the age of 5, so I know a little bit about burnout.
My name is Hollis Alger. I am an ER nurse. I recently moved from Philadelphia, where we were tackling the opioid epidemic before the COVID epidemic, and now I live out here.
And you have a newborn.
And I have a newborn.
Which is important to mention, especially in this space.
Gotcha.
I'm Sam Updegraff. I'm a family-based therapist. I do have a background at an inpatient facility during COVID as well, so maybe a little bit of background of like newbie status too.
Nice.
My name is Lauren Mast. I have a master's in social work, and I'm working as a family-based therapist in Dauphin County with Sam as my partner.
Excellent. All right, guys. Well, I want to start by just thanking you all for joining me here today. This is a topic that has weighed heavily on my heart and mind. I don't know, 10 years? But certainly it feels like the volume has been turned up in the last couple of years. And so as we sort of launch into this topic, when you all think about the impetus or sort of the origin of where the stress and burnout may be pulling from within our respective fields, what do you all see are sort of the culprits that are contributing to this endemic stress and burnout that we're seeing throughout the helping professions?
I think the nature of the work we do, trying to help people, I think the fact that we got into these helping professions means that we want to help people. People aren't always ready to be helped. And sometimes they're ready to be helped, but they need more help than we're able to give because of limitations on what we're able to do or just what's humanly possible. And I think that contributes to burnout quite easily when we're not able to do what we would like to be able to do.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes it's like running a marathon and you go to pass the baton and there's no one there. So I feel like it's like the bigger systems in place, like we're trying to help people from a medical standpoint, but then they need all different types of assistance, and we reach out and there's no one to pass the baton to. So a bigger systemic issue, which is just feels like so over your head and kind of like, you know, you're this tiny little worker ant, and it's like this huge systemic issue as far as like, you know, when you're talking about the opioid crisis and things like that and COVID and all of it.
No, I think you bring, so like we're essentially all cogs in a wheel, or like cogs in a bigger system, and then there are points in which those cogs don't connect, like there's gaps between the cogs, and then it also feels like there are times where the cogs are grinding against one another in a way that isn't helpful or useful. When we look at those big picture systemic challenges, which is really important for me here today, because I think as we talk about stress and burnout, one of my fears is that we make burnout about like, well, you don't have good self-care. And, you know, if you took more bubble baths, or if you called your mother more, or made sure you got outside more frequently, then maybe you wouldn't have burnout. But we make it the issue of the helper, and we almost compound, like, not only you burn out, but you should kind of feel shitty for being burnout because that's your fault. It's really important for me, especially here today, to zoom out and talk about the systemic challenges outside of the helper, which for a lot of reasons I think are contributing to a more, this path of more moral injury. Which is that gap in between, or which is that which emerges from coming into contact with those repetitive gaps day in and day out, realizing that we're not quite able to do enough always.
I think one of the things that needs to be included in that list of things that you had that like can almost be shamed for is not having the appropriate like work-life boundaries in like a way that is not always possible with the job that we do. Like regardless of how much work-life boundary you put in place, there's a certain element of helping professions that gets taken home with you as much as you try and leave it in the car or leave it at the hospital or leave it in your office. Like, there's an element of that that sticks with you by the nature of how close we come to people and their trauma and their history that may reflect pieces of our own that you can't just shut the door on. And so there's an element of like, how do I set boundaries around that? How do I self-care around that in a way that's effective? How do I leave that wherever it is without carrying that into my day, into my home, into my relationships? That's just really hard to navigate in like my experience.
No, and I think you bring up a very valid point, which is that our work is never done. And so if you do clock out, if you do set that boundary and go home and leave the work at 5 p.m. like you're supposed to, the question is always at what cost? And to take it one step further, and I'm not sure about other people's like personal scenarios, but Jeff, I know we both share littles at home. And so it's not like I clock out as my role of a helper in this role and then go home and get to like nurture and invest in myself. I clock out of my role as a helper and then I clock into my role as a mother. Sometimes with like seconds in between those two things, with very little time left over. And then also the guilt from the pressure of those two worlds colliding. It's like, man, I got to clock out here because I got T-ball right now. But I've got a supervisee calling me crying. I've got a suicidal teenager over here, and I've got a 5-year-old who's looking forward to his first T-ball game, and he really doesn't want mommy to be on the phone while he's batting. Like, I've got to be there and be present in that moment. And how do you square all of those different pieces at one time?
I think that also goes for like being in grad school as well and like different things. I know for me, like mine's I clock out or leave the car or wherever we're doing. And I have to go and do grad school, and like my life's very like fast paced, as we know, like who's been through grad school and like nursing school, and like your break isn't really a break. It's like I have to reset and talk about the things I already talked about all day, and like it's kind of like a grind. You just don't stop, and you don't have a choice to stop either until you're done. So it's like, how do I truly manage that, and like how do I actually live and not survive like all the time?
Gosh, it's been a minute, like, since I've been in grad school, like a minute. And I think over the years, some of the, like, the hardest, shittiest parts fade in your memory, right? Like, so for me, like, grad school was amazing. I loved it, and I had great friends, and went to fun parties, and learned so much, and had amazing supervisors throughout that time. But look, it's been that long, I forgot what they were called. And truly, many of them are dead now. So that says, like, how old I am at this point in time. But in that was one of my most burnt, like, when I look back, my master's degree specifically, I had figured it out by my doctorate. Like, but for my master's degree, I decided it's only 2 years, and I can white knuckle it for 2 years, and I'm just going to be completely miserable for 2 years, and then I can be happy when it's done. And that was like the commitment I made. And then about a year and a half in, I was like, oh, this isn't working. Like, I can't do this for 2 years. And I think for my doctorate, then made the decision, like, no, I'm going to be happy now. I don't have to wait for that, because I think also I achieved my master's, and I realized nothing changed with that achievement. Like, I thought for sure the degree would be conferred, and like the cloud would lift and happiness would set in. That's not what so spoiler alert.
I mean, I'm not surprised. I'm not waiting. I just want to get it done, you know. Like, you'll be less miserable, right? Like,
along the way.
Right.
Also, when like the content that you're studying and learning about, at least my experience with nursing school, and I did like one of those jam-packed accelerated programs, every day the content that you're learning about is worst possible scenario that can go wrong. So as opposed to when you're in the workforce, you're never getting these little moments of, there's no like beams of sunshine that are coming through. It's like the content, however many hours straight of just, these are all the horrible things that can happen to the human body, or just like, I mean, I know it's different. And that had a huge impact on, I mean, my anxiety levels, you know, and that's difficult, which is maybe why some people when you're in these professions, they are resistant to doing either more education or seeking resources outside of work to address, like, if you had a really hard work week, it's a lot easier to just leave. I don't want to talk about this to anyone. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to process it. I'm just gonna
Box it up.
Because it takes a lot more work to re-examine it, and you're like, I'm exhausted. I don't want to think about it anymore. And it's the harder thing to force yourself to do, whether it be like go see your own therapist and unpack it. That's a lot harder. It is a lot easier to go, I don't know, the bad examples of self-care, like
Binge
happy
watch
hour,
Netflix, happy hour,
margaritas,
yeah.
whatever. It's a lot easier than like making yourself actually work through it.
I think you're only talking about like the things that happen during your work week, not even about all of the things that lead helpers into helping professions. Like a lot of times I think people end up in helping professions because they've been through their own stuff. And like, you never know what's going to get triggered, whether you're in the ER or you're in the therapy office or you're in a family's home. Like, you're going to come into contact with something that probably triggers something for you, whether it's just a little, I'm activated about this thing because it's scary, or like, hey, that's my experience being played out in front of me in a way that I can't stop it because that's not actually my role in this position. Like, it's my role to facilitate change, sure, but I can't just like yell at somebody to stop what they're doing because they're causing harm to their child. Like, that won't change anything in the long term. It just probably starts a fight that is just as harmful, if not more.
No, I love that you've introduced that and brought that into the space, Lauren, because I think that that is the source of a lot of the pain that we struggle with. And at least in my experience, I think graduate programs have done a better job of it. And I don't know, I'd be curious about nursing programs. Do they ever talk about like wellness and your own like shit that's going to come up in the process and the work that you do? That's a no.
Yeah, I mean, again,
Feels like a no.
I had a very, the accelerated programs, I feel like they trim the fluff out, like not to call that fluff.
Yeah.
It's not, but it's really just like the meat and potatoes of like the clinical nursing. So no, we probably get none of that. I don't think resident physicians get a lot of it either. If anything, they get like an email that's like, hey, don't forget about self-care. Make sure you sleep. Make sure you eat full meals. Like those types of things, really helpful. But no, I don't think there's ever, it's not like in our curriculum to be aware of signs and symptoms of compassion fatigue or burnout, or teaching like healthy coping mechanisms is not something that's integrated. Wasn't my experience anyway.
I think the same thing goes for grad school. Like even my program now, and it's all online, so it's a little hard to kind of get that like interaction. But it's like, okay, you have your intensive summer class for 8 weeks, and then you have class twice a week, but like make sure you're like doing all your assignments even though you're in the field. Like make sure you're doing all the things, which like some of us can, like, we've been through it, but like it's not fair, and like we don't ever get taught like how to do it, or like let's be realistic about it and talk about self-care, not like let's go eat a meal. Like, great, I'm glad you're eating. That's your basic needs. We're talking about more than that.
Have you taken a shower today? Yeah. It's like, oh yeah, that's self-care, basic hygiene. No, I think that reaffirms sort of what I've believed. I don't know. What about your program? Did y'all go through? I know in my doctorate, we were required to do our own therapy. We weren't required. They have to give you an option. So you can either do your own therapy or write like a 37-page paper. So they gave you two choices.
What
and
an
you're like,
option.
which are you gonna choose? And it's like, therapy, please. So I think a lot of us did our own therapy, and I'm a therapist that believes deeply in my own therapy. I've done I think over the course of my life, I've probably been in therapy more than I've not been in therapy. But I feel like that is something that is part of the newer generation that we don't attend to nearly as much. And even then, it was like, go to therapy so that you can learn how to be a therapist from the other side of the line. It wasn't like, go to therapy so that you can work on your own shit, so that when it gets activated at work, and it will get activated at work, when that happens, you know what to do with it, or you have like a buffer or some resiliency. I don't know. What about your experience?
So I know from my grad program, we had a choice too. I think ours was you either went and got the MMPI personality inventory to find out what was wrong with you, or you went to therapy. Those were your two choices. And
which did you choose?
I think I chose MMPI and then did my own therapy anyway.
Okay.
So I did both. Overachiever. I mean, I'm dual licensed anyway, so I am an overachiever. I'm aware of this, which contributes to burnout, ironically. I felt like my program, at least the professors I had, did a really good job of kind of drilling it into our brains that burnout is a thing that you need to worry about and pay attention to, and self-care more than just but I think it was on a professor by professor basis, versus necessarily part of the curriculum. Maybe it was, I don't know the ins and outs, but I can think of a few professors that really just focused in on that, probably because of their own experiences in the field. And then through training and hearing, I think at startup trainings here at Pennsylvania Counseling Services, hearing about burnout and stress and trying to get it drilled in. So it was kind of something that I was aware of, and I know I'm already prone to. So it was something I kind of knew about. Doesn't mean I haven't been burned out since then, because even if you know about it, knowing and doing are two different things.
Knowledge is power, but not absolute power. There's moments there. No, I think that that's curious. And as you were talking, I was brought. So in my master's program, we had a horrific event in which we had one of my colleagues, one of my coworkers, or one of our other grad students died by suicide in the middle of the program. And I remember the day that it happened, coming into the office, and I had coming into the class, I had inferential statistics at 8 a.m., which was like the hardest class I've ever taken. And I had like my notebooks and my stickies and my highlighters, and the guy next to me would get like 100s on every exam and draw sharks in paint the whole class. No shit, like that. Literally draw sharks in paint through all of and I'm like dying. And I remember walking in and seeing like everyone's tearful, which was not uncommon for inferential statistics, but people were exceptionally tearful in this space. And I remember my inferential statistics professor coming in and trying to talk to us about it. And he was like the sweetest, nicest man, but he was a stats nerd and he was trying to get into it. And I remember him essentially saying, like, if you're struggling, talk to someone, not me. Never me. I'm not trained for this. Don't talk to me about it, but talk to someone. And I think there's a lot of that, like this amorphic, like, well, you should get help. Okay, well, I was on a therapy waiting list for like 9 months last year, a year and a half ago, looking for a therapist, calling around. Nobody had openings, calling back again. They still don't have openings. So I think there's all these really great ideas about what we can do to guard against stress and burnout, but the actual practice of it is really challenging.
And I think, I forget who said it earlier, but talked about, it's not just you do this much self-care and then it takes away the burnout kind of. But I think sometimes the amount of stress that we get put under just because of our day-to-day lives, our jobs, the traumas we're hearing about or experiencing, doesn't matter how much self-care you can do, there's going to be some level of burnout. Mm-hmm. Just because it's too high of a, if we're putting it on the scales, it's too high of a weight to be counteracted just by self-care. You have to hope that you've built up enough resiliency before that or enough reserves before that, but sometimes that doesn't happen. And it's not just an easily bounceable equation. Just, okay, if I do this many hours of self-care, then I'll be okay. But there's only so many hours in the day. Mm-hmm. You can't do that sometimes. So I just think that gets us stuck and can feed into that shame or that guilt of, why am I feeling burned out? I'm doing all this self-care. Maybe the stress is increased.
Yeah, that circles back to what you were saying. Like, this is not a personal failing of the helper. I was thinking, racking my brain to be like, what could have been done differently at my previous workplace? Because we just experienced just a mass exodus of nurses, and even before COVID. I think sometimes you can't leave it up to the individual. You have to give them a little push. And so I think about the nurses that, I don't know, maybe like one shift a week started doing administrative, like chart audits, or maybe like forcing someone to take a week and do some office work, like you know what I mean? Like sometimes people need a little push because they're not gonna, especially when you're in survival mode, you're just grinding it out. And so sometimes someone has to pump the brakes for you. Don't know who that would be, but
I mean, for me and Lauren, that's one good thing about having a team and family base. Like, the one thing I think that does come out of family base that is good is having a team. So, like, whenever we know each other pretty well, I would think. So, like, we're able to be like, no, like, we need to slow down or, like, schedule less sessions for today, or, like, we need to see this client in this space. Like, just be really intentional about our scheduling. And that also makes me think, like, Jeff, what you were saying about sometimes whenever there are younger professionals coming into the world and, like, maybe we don't have the right training and we're just thrown into it. And also, where are our emotional supports that can't understand what we're going through, but our coworkers, but we're also burnout. So, like, who do we lean on for support, like, emotionally? And, like, no one's probably going to get it because it's really hard and we can't share some of the stuff.
I was going to say, I will say candidly that Sam has yelled at me for trying to check in on days that I take off because I'm curious about what's happening, so she will not answer me.
So people that maintain the boundaries for you.
Yeah, like, it is one of the
Good
things.
job.
I know, right?
Gotta do
It's like
it.
one of the things I want to support her and be a good teammate, and, like, part of that for me is being aware that, like, Sam has grad school, so what are the days that we need to end early? How do I help maintain those balances in our schedule? And, like, relying on our supervisors and being really honest, like, hey, nope, this is a week that, like, if the thing we do in clinical supervision is talk about how we're managing our feelings, our burnout, the things that are going on, that may be what we need. Or something else I was going to say, but it is now out of my head. So
No, I think that is the role and responsibility to some degree of the supervisor to at least be checking in, and it's a difficult balance at times because I know at least here at PCS, a lot of our compensation is based upon your billables and the time that you spend in direct care. And because there's always, I imagine it was similar at your hospital, that you could always pick up a shift if you wanted to. Like, there's always more work to do. So if you want more clients, open your schedule. Take more clients. You can get more clients. We turn away 100 clients a week. No, 300 clients a week, I think was the last number I saw. So you can always get more clients. And we have financial motivators. We have other goals outside of our own wellness. And so there are times where I've checked in with my supervisees and I've been like, man, you're taking on a lot. I'm seeing a lot. How you doing with it? I'm seeing a lot. And they're like, yeah, but, like, I have a wedding I'm trying to pay for, or I want to go on this vacation, or I'm preparing for maternity leave, or whatever it is. And I need to honor your why while also trying to have really big eyes for your how, to make sure that you're not harming yourself. And ultimately, the part of burnout that we don't talk about as much is the harm that comes to the clients at the end of it. My worst days at PCS easily have been when I have had to do personnel-related interventions, specifically for more ethical concerns. So things like fraud or, like, billing concerns or boundary billing and boundaries are the two big mistakes that I have to have the really bad meetings about. None of those therapists over the course of my career were in great spots when it happened. It's not like life was going swimmingly and they're like, I'm just going to sign a bunch of billing logs on my own. Fuck it. That doesn't happen to healthy, well-adjusted clinicians that are in a good spot.
Well, I think that's the parallel process between, like, us experiencing our community that supports the helper and our clients experiencing maybe a lack of community that supports them. And so, like, trying to fill in our own gaps in our communities that support us while also trying to fill in theirs is such an interesting parallel process that can be really difficult because, like, you're then expending energy in both of those spaces when they don't know how to do it or they can't for themselves. And also you have to do it for yourself for the sake of you and for them and the other people that are involved in your life.
So, Lauren, are you telling me that isomorphs are everywhere?
Could I be? I don't know.
Everywhere. So systemic of you.
Thank you.
I love it. I love that systemic thinking. It was interesting right before this. We were talking about on call and your reactions to on call and how that's gone in different seasons. And one of the things that I thought was interesting from that conversation, but also has been a hypothesis that I've maintained, is that a lot of our burnout, I think like 80% of the burnout we experience is related to like 10% of our caseload. It's not like all of the clients that create stress or distress. It's that one little corner. And you mentioned like a specific client that I will remember for the rest of my life, and I've never met this girl.
That wasn't my client.
It wasn't your client, but called you on call. I got calls from people on call about this client. And, but I think one of the things that was most challenging about that particular client is I would put that client into the category that I've referred to, and it's probably not the best category, so I don't know, I might get some flack for using it, but this idea about like the unfortunates, like the clients that have the specific social location with this conglomeration of factors that just make them almost impossible to serve. And so they are truly suffering. They're high risk, they're high needs, but I know that this particular client was female, had intellectual disabilities, had medical concerns, came from a family system that you couldn't anchor any change within, and then also had a history of sexual offending behavior. So any program that might have taken this person prior to that, bam, like that last disqualifier was right there. So at a certain point, what do we do with this client? And I remember that particular story ended with that client in, I think, physical and medical restraints for 30 to 60 days in a hospital, looking for in an ER hospital or in some sort of holding tank, essentially, to try to find where that client goes. And I remember sitting with the therapist that was assigned to the case, and she said, well, I just go in and play Uno with her because what else can I do? Like, she's suffering. She doesn't have anyone. This is what I'm going to do. But I remember, like, looking at that therapist and, like, seeing the deadness in her eyes. And I'm like, man, like, you're laying the last bit of yourself out there for her. And on one hand, that's admirable. And I'm worried about you.
And bringing this back to something that was said earlier about there's just no resources available for people sometimes. Like this client where, there aren't programs for, or we run into a lot here in Lebanon County that there's just nothing here for certain programs or requirements. And that's when the people that we don't have those other resources end up with you in the ER, because that's the only place they can think of to go that might help them, because they can't turn them away as easily. And then you get all that, and I see some acknowledgement that that's probably the case.
Yeah. That brings up a good point, because how do we then deal with, because we're going to be faced with certain cases where, unfortunately, there is nothing we can do. And it's really hard, especially when we're used to, depending on your personality type, like you're used to being the person that fixes things, that makes things better, that makes people feel better. And there's certain situations where, I don't know if like demoralizing is the right word, but yeah, we get, especially in the emergency room, when you cannot place a psychiatric patient, we hold them most of the time against their will in like a windowless room for, could be weeks. Like, it's really difficult, and
until they can pretend to be stable enough to leave.
Yeah, until someone above my pay grade will make the decision that, like, okay, we can actually just send this person home because they're cleared. Because they've been here for... But, so, like, knowing that you're going to, when you go to work, face certain situations where it's just bad all around. Like, it is unfortunate. And it's sad, and... it's all of these things, and how do I protect my own self from just wallowing in the sadness of it. I don't know if I have a great answer for that.
And accepting the responsibility for it.
Yeah.
Because, like, if we are so used to being able to fix things, then this goes back to the, like, is it our failure for not being able to self-care or not being able to fix the problem? Like, the answer is no, it's a systemic failure, but when you're the front line, like, at what point is it your failure for not being able to find the right resource? Or how do you get away from feeling like it's your failing for not being able to find the resource, even though it's not yours?
Or even just, I mean, for me, doing direct care, these are difficult patients. Like, they're not always great to interact with. So how do I maintain instead of just, like, avoiding interacting, like, how do I actually stay, like, I don't know. How do I remain a good nurse when someone is, like, screaming, cursing, violent, blah 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 blah, all these things, and like, they're not going anywhere for, like, they're yeah. So it's a lot, but there like you said, there is a group of cases that you will interact with that unfortunately you just can't.
I mean, you could bring them to your house
yeah
and administer 24/7 care.
right.
And they might be okay for a while. But also, I think, as you mentioned, the unfortunates aren't the population that's easy to work with and friendly and smiles when you walk into their room. I mean, even that case we described, that individual had assaulted several of her therapists over the course. I mean, I had to give the supervisor directive to those clinicians. You can't go to that house alone.
Yeah.
You have to go in a team. So, 60-40 be damned. You got to be together because you are not safe in that space alone. And that when your physical safety becomes compromised, that's extremely scary. And I think that in this space is where I really like that moral injury language. Because I think that takes it away from the helper. And as helpers, we go into the situation saying, like, I want to make this better. I want to serve this person, and I want to be the best version of myself within this space. And when you're depleted in other zones, it's real easy to say, well, that case, that's the one that if I cut that, I'll have room over here for all these other people. And you have to make that extremely difficult decision to say, I will give a limited amount of myself here in service of all of this over here. But that feels like shit to the helper. Because you could give more, but at what cost?
Well, and sometimes it's not possible to just say, I can't serve this client. Like, Sam and I think, have had a couple of clients where we have felt like, this needs a higher level of care. How do we get them there? And there wasn't buy-in from the family, or like it felt like we weren't being heard very well, or maybe we weren't communicating well. And to the point that when we finally got the kid inpatient to get the help that they need and they wanted to discharge, we ended up, like, working with our supervisor and saying, we can't take this client back. Like, it is not safe for them to be in the home. It is not safe for us personally to be able to treat this client in the home with the level of risk, both for them and, like, the way that it's impacting us as a team. Like, we can't do it. Like, this is not the appropriate service for them. And it ended up being a big thing that we had to work through in our office with our supervisory team and everything else in order to actually say, like, this is what this client needs. This is our limit for being able to work with them. And how do we make that happen?
You essentially just defined moral injury off my one sheet.
Oh, nice.
So I'll throw that out here for the collective. Moral injury occurs when professionals are confronted with ethical dilemmas or situations that conflict with their moral or ethical values. In the helping professions, professionals face situations where they cannot provide the level of care they believe their clients or patients deserve, leading to feelings of guilt, shame, and moral distress.
And burnout.
And there it is. And so I think that then what do we do? And I know in those instances, we call, like, interdisciplinary team meetings, and we pull in the managed care companies, and we pull in all of the ancillary resources. So we pull in all the other burnout professionals, like the case management team, the medical professionals. If law enforcement is involved, we pull in law enforcement. If education is involved, we pull in education. And I've been in those meetings where all the professionals are sitting around and essentially saying, so who's got this? And everyone's like, not me,
Hot
not
potato.
me, not me, not me, not me. And then ultimately there's that space. And I mean, I truly do believe in the power of the collective. I think there are times where you pull everybody into those meetings and everybody leans in and says, you know what, I can take this piece and I can take this part and I can cover this over here. And if you've got that, I've got this. And I think that's the best case scenario. But when you are dealing with a depleted system, you get a whole lot of scarcity mindset and not it. And I think that just feeds the pressure on the others.
And I think it turns to finger pointing
Ooh,
of like,
yes.
oh, like we can't do this. Like we've exhausted our resource here. Like you guys have to take it. And that's where Sam and I, like, that's where we ended up where we were like, we are not comfortable with that. And so we need to find a different solution, and ended up handing it off to a supervisor to, you know, back us up and have our back there. And that is an example of where our community did like show up for us. And so like it can be really powerful when that happens. Like I think by that point it was what Sam and I needed, and like that helped to ease the end of the process for us. Now we still had to process a lot of the
Trauma.
you know, yeah, like guilt, shame, like why weren't we enough to handle this? Like why couldn't we get the system activated around the risk? But like it was not us, and we were able to get that support, and hopefully that client is doing a lot better in wherever they ended up. We just don't know.
I think you bring up a good point. I'm at least like the structure of working in like nursing and healthcare. It makes all the difference knowing that you have some type of supervisor somewhere that you feel like 100% has your back or understands or whatever. Will help you. And that's the difference, at least in nursing, like in my experience, between retention and turnover, is management that like understands it, gets in there with you, and when something goes wrong, a lot of the burnout nurses that I work with, after any type of incident, the question is always like, well, what could you have done to prevent this? What could you have done differently? And not like, I'm so sorry that happened to you. That's look at this so that it doesn't happen again. And that feeling of that, I just feel like that really makes the difference. Is the whatever your structure is, just feeling like you have backup in any way.
Well, and that's making me think of like being inpatient as well. Like I wasn't a nurse, and I'm also like not in the community, so like having mental health and physical at the same time, of like clients that need to be restrained at the same time they're having a crisis, and like I'm sure some of you guys have seen that, and like it's really hard. Like I remember doing that to some like kids who were like really struggling or like had an attempt lined up and they were trying to attempt, and I'm like, I physically cannot do this, but I know I have to. And like that's something that I'm really glad we don't have to do now. Then we're not allowed to, thank you. But it's making me think about like my staff that I had as well, and like having a really good core emotional support of people like on the shift you're on, or like wherever it is in the office, is like so important. And like we may all have like dark humor, but like that's how we get through it. Or like we all kind of stand by each other and understand that like, yeah, we're going through things together, but like they get it, even though we don't have to talk about it sometimes.
And I think having that backup that's being described allows us to better do the things that can help. You know, I'm thinking of some of the more difficult cases that I've had through my time, and looking back, could have I done a few things differently? Yeah, I could have set some boundaries sooner or things like that, and that was just my own inexperience at the time. But knowing that I had the backup to set the boundaries that I needed to set, you know, like the boundary of, hey, we're not taking this person back. It's not the right level of care. And knowing that you are going to be backed up on that, it prevents so much of the injury and the burnout that can happen. And sometimes there's not another good option. Sometimes we get stuck because the person or the family knows enough about the system to know what not to do or say to get them into a level of care they don't want to be in. So they get stuck in a lower level of care. And in my experience as an outpatient therapist, that's the place that those are the clients that are most prone to give a clinician burnout, is the ones that aren't in the right level of care, and you can't get them there because either it's not available, or they're knowing what to do or say to navigate to avoid that. They're just using the resources just enough to stay stable enough to stay out of an inpatient facility. Maybe they'll be calling crisis intervention every 4 hours and going to the ER every week.
Yeah.
Not like I've ever had any clients that did that, but it is what it is, and that's where that backup of you can set this boundary. You can say, no, you're off the clock. You're not going to answer the phone. And then that allows you to take that step back.
I think that really illustrates the need for those who make the decisions to stay in touch with the experience of providing the care. And I don't know specifically. I imagine in the healthcare world, in the physical healthcare world, it's very similar. But I know one of my commitments as an executive leader at PCS is that I plan to evermore have my own caseload and abide by all of the same rules that my therapists do. And sometimes that's really embarrassing, like when I get an AFR because I forgot to write a progress note for 2 weeks. Sorry, Lindsay. But I also think that that's really important because I am in the meetings that make the decisions about the progress notes you need to write or what rules we're going to have or how we're going to structure a certain program. And I think I should have to live by my own rules and have the experience of living by my own rules. And there are times where I live by my own rules and I'm like, oh, this is shit. This is not good. We need to change this. And gone back into meetings and said, how can we make this better? How can we save seconds? How can we make the documentation slightly less painful? Also to generalize that out, it leads to a lot of advocacy. I think that's how I make meaning out of the suffering. So I'm often advocating with managed care companies saying, hey, our rates are abysmal. I want to pay my staff more. Let me pay my staff more by giving me better rates. Oh, no, you just want to save all the money and then dump it all at us 2 weeks before the end of the year. So then we dump it on our staff, which is great. I'm sure they don't mind. But I'm sure they'd rather a higher billable rate throughout the year than those random money dumps throughout the year that are unpredictable. And now you're just doing it because you don't want to get audited by the government. Or you're doing it because you're a good person and care. Yeah,
Totally.
One or the other.
I think that's it.
And then to take that a step further, we also have certain governing bodies and legislators and other auditing organizations that come in and like check our work and give and you have to have oversight, right? And in my experience, in engaging in advocacy with those providing oversight, they're not interested in helping. They haven't done the actual work in years, many in decades. And you have to essentially, they just treat you like you're a nuisance as you chase them around and try to exact any sort of change. I'm fortunate enough that I'm really comfortable being a nuisance. I'm here for it. But it does make it really difficult to exert change when you have you ask for a meeting, they schedule it 4 months out, and then the morning of the meeting they cancel it. And then you have the same issue. I've been advocating with OMSAUS and I'll say it by name, for 2.5 years to change regulations for family-based because we're unable to hire in the current structure. And I've got a bunch of folks that haven't done the actual work in 25 years, and then they come in and well, in my day, it's like, your day was in the 80s.
Sit down.
Sit down. And you had a Zach Morris cell phone when you were on call. Right. Back up. Back up.
They haven't done it in however long, and then we hire people who have never done it at all.
Yes.
Right. So then, we're responsible for also training brand new people who are not experienced in burnout, who are not experienced in high-risk clients, who have no idea what they're walking into. And so then, there's a huge gap there between, hey, I haven't been in active service to these clients or this population in however long, and I've never, ever been in service to anybody. And, you got to marry that somewhere with, what those two experiences are like.
And you cannot.
And you can't.
And you cannot. There is no, in the Venn diagram of that scenario, the point about, they both eat food. And,
right, yeah.
There's no...
Have a background in education for human services in some aspect, maybe.
But even in those instances, to use the family-based regs for an example, they are draft regs from the 90s.
I don't feel like I wanted to know that.
Yeah, you want to know it? Now you know it.
know it.
And it includes language
Yeah,
like
it's in there
mental
now.
retardation.
Okay, great.
So you all, in order for us to even hire you, you had to have mental retardation experience. Like it's just, I don't know. It's, if,
I'm going to need
How
a
do you
minute to
measure
process
that, you know?
that.
yeah, let it sink in. So it's difficult, right? It's really difficult because we have all of these different things. And there's not this like coming together. I think again, it falls into like those finger pointing. And I remember even in our advocacy, I remember following a particularly challenging meeting with the state. Then we get an email from the same decision makers that say, hey, we're hearing you're having trouble hiring. That leads us to believe that you might be out of regulation on this, and this topic. And so please self-report, but otherwise we're also going to double check all of that.
Oh.
And the good news is PCS is incredibly anal and we are not out of compliance, so come audit me, bruh. But it's interesting because you advocate and then there's like retaliation.
Right.
If you're the, what is it,
Whistleblower?
squeaky wheel, you get the audit oil.
Yeah. Yeah. We get it to the tune about 60 times a year. But I like to squeak. What do you do?
I've been meaning to mention, I've never heard of this team-based approach before, and I don't know much about your world, but I think it's awesome. I think the reason that I lasted as long as I did at my incredibly stressful job was because my team, my co-nurses, we went into every difficult room together. I never felt alone. I 100% felt like I was always backed up, and I like literally they were, we would be side by side, and it just made all the difference in the world. Even just for me feeling physically safe, not having to deal with the spikes of fight or flight at work, which I think is something that in our profession, you like. We talk about these difficult clients, like some of them are scary. Some of them have a history of violence. Even that, just like those adrenaline spikes that you might feel in your line of work can really exhaust you by the end of the day, just physically. So
I will say the team delivered approach is what brought me to family-based
it's
right out of grad
very
school. So I
cool.
had done it as an internship in my undergrad program for social work and then returned because of the team delivered aspect of it. Because I just didn't feel ready coming out of... So I graduated from my undergrad in May of 2020 in the middle of COVID and then sprinted through grad school in a year for social work and was emerging still in the middle of a pandemic and was like, I am not ready to go insert myself in some kind of helping profession somewhere based on my degree by myself. And so that was really what brought me back to family-based was somebody was gonna be stuck with me for, 60% of my hours a week. And now it's Sam. But that was definitely like one of the things that brought me back to family-based after my internship was I'm not ready to do this by myself, even with like a supervisory team behind me in some aspect. Like felt like I needed somebody to be with me for the day-to-day until I got my feet under me.
And
So.
I think what you're describing, knowing yourself, is not to get ahead of ourselves, but protective factor to prevent some of the burnout. I like the team-based aspect. I wish I could do that in an outpatient world, but I can't because managed care won't let me or won't pay me. But
Yeah,
I also
they'll let you.
They'll let me, but they
You can
do like do whatever you want.
whatever you like,
But
but it won't be billable.
I also know that for me, family-based would not be an option because I know myself, and on-call doesn't work for me.
It doesn't work for a
I was
lot.
gonna say it doesn't work for us
doesn't
either.
work
But
for anybody, but I know I wouldn't be able to keep healthy boundaries. So I have to know that about myself. I've learned over the years what works and what doesn't. I know I can't take a day off on a Friday because I'm always inevitably behind on my paperwork. And I'll end up coming in on Friday to do all my paperwork because it's due by Saturday. So I have to take a day off on Monday because it's already done. And I learned that because I was taking Fridays off and I'm like, I'll just take Friday off. But then I was working anyway and it was pointless. Was just not getting to bill for hours because I wasn't seeing any clients. So knowing yourself, knowing where your weaknesses are, I think is really helpful as a professional in some of these places. What works for you, what doesn't, what is a great job but just might not be the right fit for you at this moment in your time.
Well, and I think also, like, going back to what you said about, like, fight or flight, and how, like, I feel like in family-based we get through that when it, like, triggers our own, like, person with therapists a lot, and, like, we don't mean it sometimes, it just happens. Like, you can't control when that comes up.
No.
Same as, like, inpatient and, like, in healthcare in the hospital, and just kind of, like, thinking, well, what are my strengths, and, like, am I able to do a job that I want to do, like, in trauma, but also, like, I can't because that's, like, my own stuff right now, or, like, I would like to be maybe, like, a trauma therapist one day, but, like, is that really feasible for, like, me to live, not survive the rest of my life, and, like, if I want a family, like, all those things I think about, but, like, if that's my strength, should I, like, reassess, you know, like, that's my training, but, like, do I want to keep doing it? So kind of, like, thinking about who do I want to be, who am I, and, like, I guess what fits right for self-care.
No, I think you bring up a really interesting point, and it's surrounding like what is the the person job fit, like the role, and how do those two things overlap effectively? And I would say that it's interesting. Like when I first started my career, we were TSSs at the time. I think now they're called BHTAPAs. But I was assigned to a little boy with autism. But I also grew up with a brother with autism, and I grew up and Down syndrome. But I grew up with a brother with pretty severe intellectual disabilities and some pretty significant issues. I also grew up with a TSS in my home 40 hours a week, every week. So I lived community based services. And I think one of the most challenging things about that role wasn't the TSS part of the job. I had a great TSS gig. I was high functioning, little 6-year-old, adorable in a bougie private school. So let's not like, of all the TSS assignments, mine was great. Mine was amazing. And even at the end of a year and some change in that, I'm like, I can't do this anymore. Like, I've got to get out. And I remember going to my supervisor at the time and saying, I will take literally anything else. But like, that just has followed me home. It's too, it's touching up against something in me that just does not feel good. And they said, do you want to work with sex offenders? And I said, sure, why not? And so that's what I did. And that didn't brush up against parts of my story in uncomfortable ways. So I could do that effectively. But since then, like since that time of like running, screaming from children's services and autism services and that sort of thing, I've since come back to the field, but I think with a different level of maturity, a different level of life experience, a different level of doing my own therapy and kind of working through some of those issues. And I think it's really important for us as helpers to recognize that our stories will impact the work that we do. And there are times where we can't do certain types of work because it touches us in a way that just isn't ever going to feel right and feel safe. And then there are times where we can almost heal through our work in some ways. Or we can heal, come back into the work, and the work can take us the rest of the way. I don't think just like staying in it, tolerating it, white knuckling it will get you there. But one of the concerns that I have about especially my COVID babies, my COVID graduates, is that y'all did have a different level of training surrounding some of those things. And what I've noticed about my younger, greener clinicians, that there are times that will say, well, that triggers me, I can't do it. And maybe that's true. And if it's true, I will honor that. But I don't like the knee-jerk, it hurts and I can't touch it. Because like not all pain is bad. Not all suffering is wrong. Sometimes pain is inevitable, and to stay into contact with it, over time, it won't be painful anymore. But it's not my job to tell you what is what, right? That has to come from that internal fearless searching.
Right, and I think something that I know, like in our work together in the past year and a half, whatever that has been, a long time, but I feel like the most powerful work I've done is whenever I heal myself while working with a client. Like that's very similar to me, which like I'm sure we could probably all kind of relate on that, of like whenever something's maybe close to like the things you've been dealing with or your trauma, and I work through that and I feel so much better after it, and I'm like, wow, like that was really powerful for them and for me, and that was a win, and that's like the best feeling ever.
It's also really powerful to watch like your coworkers grow through that. Like I can think of 2 cases where like I've been at PCS longer than Sam has, so she's my second partner, but watching her like grow and develop through like some really tough clients that were like a little close to home, and being able to discharge that client successfully and then sit with Sam in supervision after and be like, these are the places that I watched you stare your stuff in the face and work through it alongside this client has just been really powerful in itself. And I think like that's one of the things for me, and I won't speak for Sam, but I know we've talked about it a little bit, like having those sessions and having those days, like that's the meaning making for us, when we can like get in the car after our community session or our home session and be like, that was some good treatment right there. Like I watched that family do the thing without me that we've been talking about for 3 months, and they did it when we weren't even there. And like I have a dad right now who told me at the beginning of our first round of treatment that he could not talk about his emotions, and then like towards the end of the first round was like, oh yeah, by the way, I talked to my now ex about this big feeling that I had and it went fine. And I was on the phone with him and I was like, do you realize that like 6 months ago you told me this wasn't possible for you, and now you're telling me you did it? Not only you did it, but you did it without family-based support. You did it without us talking about it, without us prepping for it, and it went well.
You did it on your own.
Yeah, like you could have waited for us. Like we would have loved to support you in that, but like holy cow, like the amount of shift there, like those are the days that I think like Sam and I get in the car and are like, this is why we do this.
This is it.
Yeah, like this is why we go through the burnout and we work through it and we struggle through it and whatever, like this is the reason. And like those are the moments that I think makes it worth it.
I have a therapist who will be joining us on the Resiliency podcast, but I'm supervising her in her CPT practice, so to improve her skill set in providing cognitive processing therapy. And she told me a couple weeks ago that session 12, which is the final session of CPT, and it's the coolest session, it really is. You read the original narrative, and then you rewrite and read a new narrative of the trauma account and like the why, and make meaning out of it. And you get to read them back to back. And it's this moment of like immense anchoring and really seeing the little steps you've taken along the way to see how far you've come. And she's like, yeah, session 12 is my drug of choice. Like, I want more of that. How do I get more session 12s in my life? But we don't always get session 12s.
Right.
We don't always get those moments. But I think it's really important for us to turn our eyes to them and soak in them and revel in them and talk about them and share them with supervisors and colleagues and, you know, in as far as it's HIPAA compliant, like friends and family, like, man, I had a great therapy session today. I fucking nailed it. Like, but we don't do that as a field. For the most part, we keep our supervision and consultation and group supervision time to talk about what's wrong and what's burning and where things aren't working and where things aren't effective. And I don't want to have that like toxic positivity, like tell me something good. But every once in a while, I think it's important to intentionally turn our eyes towards the light and say, in this space, things are going really, really well. And I understand that this crisis client is robbing me of a lot of my joy right now. But this is really working over here. And I want to give it some attention as well. But I think that takes discipline. And it's not necessarily always intuitive. Because I love to complain.
And that's something that I try to do as I supervise people towards their licensure, because it's really easy to get into who you're struggling with this week. Trying to highlight the positives, like what's going really well. You know, what's the one client that you feel like you've just been rocking, and it's been really powerful. But not just in that, but also in my work as a clinician. If I'm working with a client who's got all this crap happening, and then you're trying to find that one piece of, hey, you did that really well. Or despite all of this, you didn't go back to this really bad behavior or really bad coping mechanism. That's a win. And redefining what a win looks like. Because I think when life comes crashing down, wins are hard to come by. And if you look for just the big stuff as wins, there aren't any. And then it's really easy to get really down, burned out because you're not seeing anything, versus, hey, this person stayed stable despite having a global pandemic happen. That's a win.
Yeah.
You know, someone with a chronic mental illness didn't get worse when COVID hit. That's a win, even if it doesn't look any better. So really just redefining that for yourself and for clients we work with, patients we work with, when, hey, that person lived the night when they might not have thought that that was going to be the case, that might be a win.
Yeah, sometimes you got to dig really deep for the wins. And I'd be interested to know, and I think we should be, if you're dealing with a certain population, like when you have drug and alcohol abuse, going into it statistically what the relapse rates are, right? So every time you walk into a room with someone who says like they're ready for detox, and you have to like kind of, you don't want to be cynical, but you also have to be, you don't want to get your heart broken. So you need to protect yourself a little bit with still being able to have optimism and still being able to somehow find the win because sometimes they run dry a little bit. So whether that, I don't know if that, I've never been a journaler ever. I never will be. But if that works for you, then maybe you can like look back, and if you're journaling and like actually be like, wow, I had to go back a
couple pages there.
Yeah, a few chapters, but there's one, and I completely forgot how that feels, but that was cool, and it can happen again, and yeah, so finding the win, sometimes it's like you feel like you're like in the desert, but
Even the example you gave of the person who says they need detox, even if the detox doesn't end up in sobriety or clean time and recovery, it's a win in that moment.
Yeah.
Because for that moment, they acknowledge they need help.
Right. Or maybe it gives like their loved ones a few days of
Peace
interacting
of mind.
with that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
When I can remember we had a therapist here a couple of years ago. He actually passed away a few years ago, but he was a phenomenal clinician out of our Lancaster City office, who did a lot of substance use work, and also had his own history with substance use disorders. But he was one of the ones that beat the odds and finally came out the other side. But he would be very transparent in telling a story, and I did get his permission to share this piece of it. He had said that he had gone through 11 rehabs before he had his final use date of use, before he started his clean time. And he said in those 11 rehabs, he picked up little nuggets along the way, and there are things that he learned or were brought into his awareness from his very first stint in rehab that kept him sober today. But one of the hardest things for me in the therapy field is that we're planting a lot of seeds. We don't get to see a lot of it grow. No. And sometimes we do, right? Like every once in a while, but a lot of it's just planting seeds. And I've gone to clients' funerals, and I've sat with clients' family members who've said, like, I thought they had it. Like, I don't understand, like, how they relapse, or why are they, I've had clients' family members call me and say, like, they need to go to jail. Like, how do I get their probation officer? Or what, like, someone needs to stop them because they're going to die. Please help me. And even in that moment, it's like, it's hard to find the positive reframe. But to have helped the family to then know what to do in a relapse, it's like, man, like, it sucks that this client relapsed. That's heartbreaking. I don't know how many more relapse. I can think of that client in particular. A gentleman in his 60s that was still actively using substances. It's hard to be an old drug addict. It's just, you don't get that opportunity often. And I remember when his daughter called me, like, that was the win, was that, like, his family knew what to do. And I remember actually getting a letter from him in prison. I could tear up talking about it, but getting a letter from him in prison saying thank you. Like, the fact that my daughters, like, took action and did something saved my life and is now giving me another shot at recovery. And when you were having those family sessions, telling them to call the police if I came home high, I was really pissed at you. But you saved my life, and thank you for that. And, like, that's one of those things that it's easy to say, like, that's a loss. That doesn't fall in the win column. But, like, maybe it's just a different kind of win.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Definitely.
I think Lauren has a really good reframe. I'm going to let you have it, of perfection. And I feel like that's something that's really helped, like, for us as well, like, kind of live in the moment and, like, be realistic about things and, like, the change that we see. But You say it well, so I'll let you say
I was
it.
gonna say, you're gonna put me on the spot and
Yeah,
I'm
I
gonna mess it
will.
up.
It's your reframe.
So we had a client that was really stuck on the perfectionist thing and like, I need to be perfect. And so in one of our sessions with, I think it was the client and their mom, like we had just suggested, like, what if like being perfect or like perfectionism is just giving what you have in the moment, whether that be 5%, 15%, 80%, 100%, 110%. But like what's perfect for that moment is not giving the 110 that you don't have. It's giving that 5% that you do have to do something just a little bit differently, even if it's like, maybe we lay here on the floor and be a potato instead of like looking for something to hurt ourselves or overeating or I don't know, like whatever
Putting a
that might
needle
be.
in our arm, whatever
Yeah,
that
like
is.
whatever it is, like that 5% of effort or even lack of effort to just lay on the floor instead, like that is perfect for that moment. It doesn't have to be guilt or shame for not having the 100. Like that 5% is what you have, and putting that 5% in, that's what counts.
No, if I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times, is that I don't want anyone, any of my supervisees, any of my staff, to sacrifice themselves on the altar of community mental health. I know that this work is hard. Community mental health is for me forever. I'm a lifer. I'm in this forever. And I will be different because I've worked in community mental health my whole career. When I'm 90, I'm going to say 90 and on my deathbed. 90 feels like a good round number to go out. When I'm 90 and on my deathbed, I will be a different human in that moment than if I quit PCS today and tomorrow went out and started my own private practice and just did like some cushy private practice is hard in certain ways as well, but it's not as hard as community mental health, and we're not going to, like, do anyone disagree? No, okay. So I will be a different human because I made this choice versus that choice. But I never judge or fault anybody who makes the other choice, because I think there's no honor in self-sacrifice to the point that you have nothing left.
It's like the concept of the martyr.
Yeah.
Helpers as martyrs.
Oof.
I was thinking about this when you're
That's a
talking
tough
about knowing yourself, to know, what's a good fit and on call is a good fit for you. Well, yourself is like constantly evolving and changing. So having to really check in every once in a while to be like, is this still a fit for me, or is this not? And I don't know. I mean, we're obviously, like, you got into it for some initial reason, so maybe it's like a short-term thing that's going on, and maybe you can come back to it, but everyone's always evolving. And I think when you talk about causing harm to, like, your patients or your clients, whatever, it's like definitely the nurses that I've worked with that have stayed in it for way too long.
Yep.
Way too long. So yeah, just like re-examine, come back to it, be like, is this still a good fit? I think that's like really important when you're talking about burnout.
And it brings me to something. Is it Tara who does the training on resilience is a discipline?
Resilience is a discipline.
And I went to a training about that, and it's really hit home for me ever since, is that it's not a self-care, just get everything in balance and it just stays there. Because it doesn't. Like you said, you have to, life changes, you change, don't do things the same way you could when you're 20, when you're not 20 anymore, when you've got kids in the mix, when you've got other life situations. And the self-care has to change. The job might have to change. At the current moment, I have no plans of changing my job. I'm not promising that it'll be there forever, because I don't know what life's going to throw at me next. And, that reassessment is key, because you can't just set it and forget it and think it's going to be good forever.
And I think to recognize that you'll have different needs throughout different seasons. I think, catch me in my early 20s, I would have been a bomb-ass family-based therapist. I would have loved that. I would have loved it. I would have loved the crisis. I would have loved the on the go. I would have loved the living out of my car. And like, I don't say that lightly. Like, I would have been the right
believe it.
personality for that role once upon a time. Now with 2 kids at the house, school aged, navigate. My little baby goes to kindergarten next week. You know, like, I'm just not at a season where I can do 4 nights a week in the field. In my early 20s, I mean, I got home at 9, 10 o'clock every single night because I was at inpatient and I loved what I did and I just didn't leave. And the work was never done, so it was easy to do. And my husband and I both had student loans, and so he was always at work all about those billables, and it just worked for us in that season, but it's not going to work for us in this season. And I think it's a really nice segue to take us into some of our questions for today's pod. So we're always accepting for the questions for the panelists. If you have any questions yourself at home, any of our listeners, email them to me at kim@howtobehappyhour.com. I'm always happy to accept questions through that space. And we do have a couple upcoming pods talking about resiliency within the helping professions. We're going to be talking about pets. We have a pod coming up on motherhood. So we're going to tackle a bunch of other topics. So if you're interested in submitting questions for that, please get them my way. But one of the questions for today is what happens when it's life outside of work that's creating these challenges and making it difficult to carry the work that we do? What do we do when it's the external stressors? Maybe the work season is all right, but life outside of the work is really contributing to that stress, distress, and burnout. And what do we do in those spaces?
I feel like for me, I know I talked about grad school a little bit and like how I know I always say it to Lauren of like, it's like 3 different things. Like I have my personal life, my social life, well 4, grad school and work. So like I can't get all of those. So like if I don't have a personal life, it's because of grad school and work and like kind of delegating like what's my priority. And like that leads to a lot of burnout of like, what do I need this week? And like, what's my upcoming month look like? And like, will I have a social life? I don't know. We'll see what happens. Like, and sometimes if my personal life is not going well, then like usually my work's not going well.
And you know, this is where I'm at in a lot of ways with the little ones. 2-year-old who doesn't like to sleep past 6 a.m. if I'm lucky, and I'm not a morning person by any stretch of the imagination. So it was a good day today. I got to sleep. Well, I was only woken up twice and got to sleep till 6:30. So that was a good night. You know, I'm at a stage of my life where I'm regularly taking naps in my office, 5-10 minute naps between sessions because that's what I needed. And it wasn't something I realized was happening at first. Until I got into it a little bit, is going, ooh, I'm not doing quite as well as I thought I was at work because I'm exhausted from home. You know, the emotional exhaustion of having little kids that terrible 2s and, you know, preschool age and almost 1-year-old, it's hard. And trying to figure out how it's actually carrying over, and am I taking the time to take the breaks at home because that's what I need. Coming into the office is the quiet area for me right now, which is usually the other way around. So it's a challenge, and I don't have perfect answers. I feel like in some ways it's easier when it's the other way around because you can clock out of your job. You can't clock out of life. And when the burnout is coming from life, it can be a really big challenge.
Not to be the systemic therapist in the room, but like I'm wondering if this is where we go back to that conversation about like the community that surrounds us and like the parallel process for our clients, but like really focusing then on like where are the gaps in like my own community or like the spaces that I can maybe horribly stressfully have to ask for help. Like, first one to admit I'm horrible at asking for help. Like, even identifying like this is a thing that you can do to help me can be really stressful because I don't know a lot of the time like what is the thing that is actually going to feel helpful versus is going to feel another burden that I have to carry to allow you space to help me. Like if identifying some of those gaps is really part of the solution for both the work stress burnout and like when life is the thing that is doing the burning. It's like finding those gaps and ways to fill them.
Well, it's also like a double-edged sword because if you don't open up to those people in your life that are there for you and support you, then how can they help you? Like you can't share that if you're not ready to share that information. It's a little sticky.
Yeah. Well, and to what degree do you feel comfortable sharing that information? I know that I think one of the hardest work seasons that I had was coming back to work right after my brother passed away. And I remember thinking, like, oh my gosh, my stomach's growling. I remember coming back into the office and like looking, one, I don't like when people give me sad eyes. So like that's like triggering for me. I really don't like sad eyes. And I remember like walking into the office the first day and like everyone knew, right? Like just everyone knew because of my role and my position and Roy's role and everything. So there was like no reprieve of it. And so I remember for me, I wanted to come into the office and have the office be a break from it. But I had so many people that were showing me care and I was like, keep it to yourself. I don't need it in the break. So I think some of that is also like telling people that you need to have that balance and you need to have those boundaries and that you like appreciate the support. But I don't want to talk about how I'm doing in the lunchroom while I'm refilling my water. I'm holding it together in this moment. I will break apart the minute I get into my car. But right now, I'm holding it together, and your sad eyes and your compassionate questions are about to fuck all of that up for me. So please, like, keep them to yourself. I also feel like during that season, I took more time off than I ever did before. I worked my minimum. Like I dropped under, I usually average 50 hours a week, and I'm contracted at 45, and I had to say, like, I'm going to use PTO every week. I'm staying at 40. I'm not working more than that. And even in that, I was challenged by my caseload. I do a lot of trauma work, and inherent in trauma work is grief work. A lot of times that goes hand in hand. And my experience of being sort of lost in my own grief and having to guide somebody through their grief, gosh, it just was exceptionally challenging. And you can't tell your clients, right? Like I can't go in and be like, "Ooh, you're dead, mom. Not today, friend, because I don't have room." No, you have to show up and you have to be present and you have to provide the clinical work and use. I mean, that's when I used my supervision, my consultation. And there's a reason why supervision and consultation are part of ethical best practices. And I think it's one to make sure you're doing what you need to do. But I think the other side of that is because of that power of the collective and the community and connecting with your community and reaching out. And I'm an isolator. If I'm struggling, I just like to cut it off and grieve in isolation and feel sad on my own. I'm also pretty introverted and I talk 40 hours a week. So by the end of the week, I don't have a great social life because I'm kind of talked out. Now I have small kids and they don't care if I'm talked out. So I don't quite have the balance that I would like all of the time. But even then, it's about being intentional and looking forward in my week and saying like, all right, I realize I'm totally talked out and tapped out, but I want to go see Hollis and her new baby and hang out there for a minute and be a human. And so I'm going to make myself do that because I know when I leave there, I'm going to be delighted and happy I did, even if the moments leading up to it, I'm like, gosh, I just want to hide in a hole and be away from everybody. But it's hard, like forcing yourself to do the types of self-care that sustain you, but aren't necessarily what you want to do in the moment.
Yes, that's where I need like a little push. Like I'm not the type of person that has a lot of not like willpower, but yeah, some people need a little extra push to do the thing that they know is best for them and will make them feel better in the long run. But so I mean, I don't think that means I should have more required like PowerPoint education things at work about like what is
so
burnout.
PowerPoints are not the solution.
Yeah,
Is that what you're saying? That really
no.
chaps my asshole. I was really hoping PowerPoints
Make
were the
me
answer
feel
here today.
better. Yeah. But I think like circling back to realizing how distracting even small life stressors can be at home. It doesn't necessarily, I mean, obviously there's some really big ones and you are kind of more aware of like, I'm distracted, I'm in my own head, but small stressors can also have a huge impact. And I don't know if I have a great answer for how to balance that going into work, making sure that I'm here, I don't know what the answer to that is. I know that for sure, achievers like us, helpers, it's extra hard for us to speak up. I never went to my manager and said like, hey, I'm going through some stuff. Can we look at the schedule? Can we, whatever? Because I knew that my team that I cared so much about, we were all drowning. We were like, so that's a really hard thing for us to do, is to say like, hey, actually, like I'm struggling, because we don't want to leave our teammates high and dry. So
Yeah.
I don't know what the answer to that is either.
And I think for me, things that I've kind of picked up on is it's okay to not do the level of work that you might do when things are normal. It's okay to say no to things. I know in the last few months I had the opportunity. I could have taken a client that I thought would have been a really good fit for me, a kid that needed some play therapy would have been perfect for me. And I had talked to my team leader about it because I was feeling conflicted, because I knew it was a lot of heavy trauma stuff around that client, and we'd made the decision it wasn't right for me at this time. I would have liked to work with the kid, but I know I don't have the energy reserves to work with that situation right now. Being able to speak up and say, I'm not doing okay. And for this side of the table, it's not our job to figure out if everybody else is drowning. That's your job.
Yeah.
as an executive, as the management.
Trust me, it's not lost on me.
And I think that's something that we don't always think about. And it's easy to go, well, I can't ask for help because everybody else is struggling too, but that's not my job. My job is to speak up to my management and say, I'm struggling in this area, and it's their job to figure out how to make that work. And that comes with the pay grade of getting the management position. I
think that to me is the secrets. I've never had an employee come to me and say, hey, I need to take FMLA, or I need to take a leave of absence, or I need to go part-time, or I need to leave. I mean, and responded with like, oh, well, what, you know what I mean? To some degree, it's like, all right, well, so what are your ideas about covering your caseload? Because you're the expert on your own job. So my hope is that you have some ideas, because truthfully, I don't have any, but I'll figure it out. And I think that's always been my approach, is like, you take care of you, we will absorb everything else. And I think that's one of the nice things about being a large organization, is that it's easier for us to absorb some of those things. I also think that we've reached a point as an organization where our identity of like, we take everything that has been left behind, we fill all the gaps, to saying we're really good at filling these gaps, and these gaps over here, that's not our thing. And so we won't be filling it. We just had somebody reach out to us a couple weeks ago saying like, we're not happy with our provider for this halfway house, and will you please put in an RFP and take on this contract? And while I would love to be able to do it, and we have a great relationship with that organization, and in a perfect world, we would be able to meet that need. That's not been our strength area. We've not been successful when it comes to doing housing and some of those different kinds of things. And we've had to say like, hey, I'm really sorry. I know you're stuck. But we've got to say no at this time, and we need to allocate our resources over there. And we've closed programs as a result of it. We've left certain, this year we made the difficult decision to remove one of our school-based therapists from a school that really needed a therapist. But organizationally, the way the managed care companies and the schools and PCS has needed to define the role, it just wasn't working. And so I think there are times where at the organizational level is where we say, we are choosing to acknowledge that there is a gap there, and we are choosing not to step in because we don't want to sacrifice our staff or our role. And PCS is coming up on 40 years of doing the work that we do. And there's a reason why we've been around for 40 years when other organizations have closed or stopped providing care. And I think part of that has been a mindset of sustainability. And ultimately, that's where my job becomes paramount. And I think that that's what we need. And I wish when I turn to like the managed care organizations or the regulatory bodies that tell us how to do the work, I wish I could then turn to them and be like, hey, you know, if you didn't have all these regulations about a halfway house, like all of them, like these 87 pages, or if you paid more over here, like we could solve this problem one of two ways, less of this or more of that. But if you're not going to do either of these things, and they're not the same person, so it's not like they're both called with it. They just like to point at each other and be like, oh, we'll have them pay you more. Okay, can I have more money? No, just have them require less. Okay, can I reduce the regulations? No, actually, upon looking at it, we actually have more regulations. Fuck! Like that, and that's the process. Like that's the pattern that we find ourselves stuck within. But at the end of the day, it becomes our job as like the executives and as the leadership of a community mental health organization to say where we invest our resources and where we preserve our resources. And that's a hard decision to make because you sit and you see the need and you know that no one else is going to do it well, but also having that acknowledgement to say like, I don't know that I can do it well or with sustainability. So that brings us to our last question, and then we'll move into our last call. But what about real self-care? So we've talked about Real Self-Care is a book I read maybe 6 to 9 months ago now, exceptionally good, by a physician who struggled with stress and burnout throughout the course of her med school career. And she goes into all the different ways in which people market self-care, make money off of self-care, create guilt and shame and blame surrounding self-care. But ultimately, the book dives into the few things that are actually effective in terms of self-care. And so for those of you around the table, what actually works in terms of self-care to get you where you need to go?
One of the things that I do as soon as I get home, even if I don't need to shower, is I will go shower.
Me too.
Like take off my work clothes and just like let the day, whatever it is, even if it's traumatic or not, like I'm gonna wash it off and just like reset for the day. And that's like, as soon as I get in, I like put my stuff down and I go straight up. Like I do not care what I have to do. That's the first thing I am doing because that's me resetting for like my evening and like my personal life, whatever that is that day, grad school, I don't know. Whatever it is, it's just like work is done and I'm gonna leave it wherever it needs to be.
So that's been one of your rituals.
Yeah.
And I think ritual is really important. So I appreciate you bringing that into the conversation.
I think I struggle with forcing myself to do self-care for myself, but that's why having a dog was really helpful, especially like when living in Philadelphia, when dealing like at the peak of like my stress at that job. I don't know if I would have taken a walk around like a pretty neighborhood for myself necessarily. I don't think I would have carved out that time every day, but I had to. And I had, you know, so every day we would walk to this beautiful little park and before my shift. And I mean, yeah, I don't know if I would have made myself that priority, but I somehow structured it through a dog that I had to. So it was like a way to like trick myself. So yeah, sometimes you need that extra motivator.
Speaking of like walks and things, exercise is one of the ones that work best for me. I know running it was hard for me because I had a back injury a couple years ago and back surgery a year ago, so I'm just getting back into it. But you know, for me, I like when I run. I don't always like starting to run. Usually that was always a struggle. What worked for me is that I would try to get signed up for a 5K because now I know I'm going to do it. And I really don't want to show up to a 5K having not run ever because I'm going to die. So just having something that was like a boundary of, hey, this is going to happen. You know, accountability there really helped. Exercise, whenever I do it, you know, I don't like to lift weights. It's not my thing. But a run was something I could squeeze in. The kids are all asleep. It's 9 o'clock. I'm running around the sidewalks around my house because that's the time I have to do it. You know, I think for me, video games was also something that sometimes was effective because it takes me away. Things that aren't effective, scrolling the internet, you know, reading, you know, doing things like that that are kind of, they're the junk food in my mind. they might fill the time, but they don't make me feel any better afterwards. Don't feel worse, but don't feel better. So those are a couple.
No, I mean, I feel like I certainly have my indulgent self-care models, right? And I think those are okay in moderation all the time. Like, I think it's okay when you are completely depleted. Every once in a while, I mean, for me, it was bad reality television, angry red wine, and smelly cheese. And, like, if I put those things together for an evening, yes. Now, when I put those things together and string a couple evenings of that side by side, it becomes increasingly less effective as it goes on. And so I think in my work, what I've discovered is that like sunlight, movement, water, and food are, and boundaries. So I'm going to go with sunlight, movement, water, food, boundaries. When I can get those 5 things in place, I'm almost unstoppable. The problem is I love Ben and Jerry's, like love them, and don't always have the energy and the motivation to do the less indulgent self-care. I know one feels good always, the other does good with consistency, and that's the balance that I have to kind of force myself into. And like disconnecting from everything. So I know that my best nights are the days that I turn off my phone and put it upstairs and just am present wherever I am instead of worrying about like, oh man, last time I saw Sam, she was really struggling. Sure hope she's okay right now. Or like checking my email at Little League games or scrolling Instagram. I love to scroll Instagram, but scrolling Instagram for hours on end, like, yeah, feels good in the moment, not effective or sustainable self-care.
I think another thing for me too is like being intentional about my time alone. Like I love to isolate. We know this. So like after work I'll shower, but I'll isolate. So like kind of determining like, do I want to isolate or like, do I want to go hang out with my roommate? Like what's my limit for today and like what are my boundaries for today? And they're always changing, which is hard, even if you have like the same principle. So kind of like determining, am I really doing this for self-care or is it like I'm just over it and I'm burnout? So kind of like figuring out that line.
My wife and I have a language about this of, the me time, but quality me time. Because in the language when I work with couples, we, not just time together, not sitting there on the quality time together, but I think it applies to your own alone time too. Are you taking the time scrolling Instagram or whatever your thing of choice is, or are you doing something that it's just you and you're going to feel refreshed afterwards? And trying to remind myself to take the quality me time and not just alone me time.
I think that goes for like quality, like social friend time as well. Like Sam and I just had this conversation this morning, I think on the way here, about how like it feels silly to have to schedule your friends in for like phone calls and check-ins and stuff. But like that really is kind of like necessary, especially like being out of college where my friends were like 15-minute walk from me for a lot of the time. Like now my friends live in Reading and in Lancaster and live in Mechanicsburg. So like finding time to actually connect with them intentionally, whether that be we play a video game online and like work through that once a week and like have fun that way while being on the phone, or trying to like be really intentional about the time that I'm going out and visiting them and being like, hey, I'm setting aside this Saturday to come spend the whole day with you guys for whatever. Maybe we do like sit and watch a movie and like that is the downtime, but it's that quality time together that's like really important, even when I get home from work and I'm like, well, I'm going to go binge watch something on some streaming service somewhere. Like that's not going to help me day after day after day, like you were saying.
And that's one of the things that I tell my clients and I try to do myself, is that when you're spending time with a friend or somebody that you don't necessarily get to see, before you actually leave, schedule the next one. Put it on the calendar, because it's so easy that you go home, I'll give you a call when I look at my schedule, and then it's 2 months later and nobody's contacted each other because life happens. But if it's on the schedule, at least you have to call to cancel. So you're at least going to connect somehow, or text, because nobody calls anymore.
But don't ever call me.
We don't do calls. It's a problem.
It's a problem.
If there's a phone call, there's an emergency.
On fire.
But yeah, if you put it on the schedule, and I found when I do that, it works.
Yeah.
I'm an introvert as well, who works in a helping profession, talks to people for a living. I don't want to socialize sometimes. I know I need it. I need to get better at it. And then having small kids makes it even harder because it's bedtime now. I can't, can't go anywhere because everybody's asleep, and I can't just leave them sleeping there. So it's a challenge, but I think trying to get something on the schedule, trying to find the people that their schedules will match up with yours the best they can.
Or that are willing to make the effort
Yep.
for their
Right.
schedules to match up with yours, because if you just wait for the convenient time, there will never be one.
Yep.
Yeah. And finding the individuals and like the humans in your orbit that refill your cup.
Right.
Because I've also been in that space where I was really working to create like space and intentionality. And then I would get to where I was going, and it's just a whole like this massive sucking sound of energy from the moment you walk in the door. And I think to some degree that involves not just boundaries in your professional life, but setting and maintaining boundaries in your personal life. And sometimes that means setting and maintaining boundaries with family members that draw from you, or like longtime friends that draw from you, or different types of things like that. I mean, there are even times, I think I'm fortunate in that I have an amazing marriage and an incredible partner, but we both work in this field and we both work at this place. And there are days where like I sprint through the week, sprint through the day, like white knuckling it. I'm gonna get to 5, 6 p.m. and be done, and then I'm with the kids, and they're teething or angry, or I don't know what they're doing in that moment, but like it's not a positive moment. And so we finally like shove them into their bed and put them back into their bed, and then put them back into their bed, and then put them in different beds, and do that thing. And then I turn to my husband at like 10:30 at night, and he's like, "Man, today was really shitty. Let me tell you about it." And it's like, "No, no, I'm going to sleep. There's no words." Even in really healthy, meaningful relationships, sometimes you really need to say. And I imagine like in partners that work together and care about each other, you might have to every once in a while say like, "Hey, that's your shit. Hold on to it for a while. No room here." And I think that that's okay, especially when y'all know and trust each other and realize that, I think my husband knows by now that I'm never going to say like, I don't have room when I have
Right.
room. And so we trust each other for that. But it is hard. It's hard to turn to him and be like, "Listen, you didn't ask me to be a psychologist that wanted to save the world, but I'm going to ask you to stuff your shit down right now, so that because I can't save you in this moment." But it's a balance. So I think that brings us to our last call here today. And the last call that I was hoping to discuss is calling things traumatic that are not, in fact, traumatic, and the hyperbolic sense of language that we have approached, or that we tend to approach most things here in 2023. I think a lot of media drives some of these pieces. I think everyone, if you're not screaming, no one's listening at times. And so I think individuals maybe come from family systems or from different organizations where they feel the need to use extremely like volatile or polarizing language in an effort to garner attention. But my big picture fear in that is that long term, if everything is a crisis, then nothing becomes a crisis. And so if we are going to dilute the experiences, which we refer to as traumatic, like I was working with a supervisee the other day, and they're like, "Yeah, well, they woke up, they missed the bus, and that was a traumatic experience for them." And like, no, it's not. That's not an inherently, like, unless they missed the bus and then were like kidnapped by the Gestapo, like then that's a traumatic experience. But without that, can we modulate our language just a little bit, and reserve some of these things like burnout? I've had brand new clinicians to the field come in and say like, "I'm extremely burnout." And it's like, yeah, you're overwhelmed, you're exhausted, you're scared. But let's call it what it is. This isn't, on week one, it's not burnout. It can be a lot of things, but it's not that. And so let's put words to it in a way that allows us to interact with that content effectively.
Yeah, words have power. And you see a lot of this on social media where people are just like, "I'm so OCD." I mean, like,
TikTok told me I have autism.
well, and just like throwing it around, like the person doesn't actually believe. It's just, yeah, it's like the whole language, the way people use it. It's not what it should be. But I think a lot about triage in my job because we are trained on it and constantly trained on disaster, like mass casualty, disaster triage, which is like we use a color system. So yeah, that's a big part of my job is triaging, and everyone's pain is a 10 out of 10 means that all of a sudden
You don't know
nobody's
where to
pain
put
is
the resources.
and then it means, yeah, it's like, okay, well, so everybody is the same acuity then, but right, exactly, like it's all about who needs immediate resources and who doesn't. And yeah, so I mean, it's really easy for people to use words like 10 out of 10, or yeah, trauma, blah, blah, blah. But those words have an impact, and I think people need to be mindful of that. It's like, no, that was a setback, or that was, yeah, that was difficult, not ideal, but not a traumatic event.
And how do we honor different developmental phases and stages for traumatic events? Because I also know that like pain and trauma is relative. So I remember I use this example a lot, so it's probably repetitive for some of y'all, but when I was working at Renaissance and seeing kind of like back-to-back clients, I had a mother that lost her 2-year-old in an accident, in a car accident, one session, and then directly after that session, I had a 13-year-old going through her first breakup. And it was obviously quite easy to find compassion for the parent that just lost a child, like eminently, like just lost a child in the throes of grief. It was real hard to go from that session into the 13-year-old, and it's like, yeah, he really was the love of your life.
Right.
But like to her, that's the worst pain she's ever felt.
Right.
And so I can imagine also how in having those two experiences, like going from that client we were talking about earlier, to like maybe a client that yells at you and tells you they don't like your treatment recommendations, like one
That
is
would never happen.
yeah, never. They're always respectful and honor exactly what we
Every
say
time.
every time and appreciate us. We're so appreciated, but that's a little bit different. Like that's a one-off. That's a one-time event. We have to learn how to tolerate it. We have to build up a little bit of scar tissue for that, or else you're not going to sustain in this field for any period of time. Versus on the other hand, when you're in touch with somebody who simply is beyond the scope of help based upon the available resources, you're going to carry that differently. And finding that balance and not invalidating the person over here, but also in some ways saying like, but it's not like, let me help you get through it. It's not insurmountable, I suppose.
And I think context, and it can be, I think, challenging at times because especially, when we go through grad school and nursing school, all these things, and empathy and all validation is very, sometimes you might need to push back a little bit. Sometimes you might need to put things in the context of what they really are. This is really hard for you right now. It's not the hardest thing you've ever gone through. You've gotten through worse, and pointing to the resiliency and helping them see this is hard now, but it's not going to be hard forever. And it's a balancing act to do that in a way that doesn't come across as inauthentic or invalidating, but I think it can be an important step to take as you try to work through it. I think as humans, we like to speak in very all or nothing terms and very, this is the most divided the country's ever been, but we had a civil war, so it's not.
Right.
It's
Not actually true.
Yeah. So just kind of gentle pushbacks occasionally, or just have you considered, this alternative, or okay, compared to whatever. So
it's delicate though, because nobody wants to be told that their lived experience or what their experience emotionally, I mean, pain is subjective and emotional pain is subjective. So for that 13-year-old going through a breakup, that might have been the first time she ever experienced loss.
Yeah.
So yeah, but providing the perspective without coming off as, well, there's starving children in.
At least you don't have cancer.
At least you don't have. Yeah, that's not helpful.
No. And I think the power of and.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard and X, Y, or Z instead of the either or, and trying to just broaden it a little bit wherever they're at, meet them where they're at, and redefine a little bit.
I think it's also hard when like we have this use of the word like traumatic or depression, anxiety, whatever, that becomes such like a desensitized then context for like our kids that really have been through trauma that then discount their own trauma of like, well, at least this didn't happen to me. Like I have friends that struggle with this and that didn't happen to me, so I can't have trauma, or like that thing can't have been traumatic. Or like a kid that we were talking about before, like had some pretty significant bullying, it sounded like, that really contributed to their depression. That was traumatic for the age that they were at, that they're still carrying with them. Well, that can't be trauma because I was only bullied a little bit, or it wasn't really bullying because I let them do it, or whatever that was. Like having to then introduce like, yes, like it could have been worse. And also, this was a really big developmental impact for you for the age that you were at. And like, it's okay to call that trauma and for that to be traumatic for you for where you were. And I think we had, with that particular kid, talked about like little T trauma versus big T trauma. So like, maybe it doesn't feel like big T trauma where you weren't kidnapped or you weren't assaulted or whatever. Like those things are really big and really important. And also like, this may have been little T traumatic where like, it had a lasting impact on you and it's something we're still struggling with, and it's okay to name that for what it is. And like building the distinction almost that way of like both things can be true.
I like that.
I was also thinking about like not to make us all feel like something's always like our work's always hard and like it's never going to be good, like kind of thinking about like the negative light of our job and like how other people may not understand that like we go through experiences, but are they traumatic, you know what I mean? Or like is every day like each different session is a hard stressor, or like just kind of rethinking about like how other people may not understand, which I hope they don't, like the things that we have to deal with or go through, but like some people just don't get it, and like it's really hard to like adjust and figure out like what are the things that work for us, and like just like how are we humans, I guess. How do you do it? I do it.
And I think, but you do it, I mean, I think you don't do it without some semblance of suffering along the way.
Right.
Like and I've had this conversation in so many rooms and so many spaces. How do we support early career clinicians in learning the skills that they need to learn? Because you go to grad school and you learn some really important skills, but they don't train you for every eventuality. You also have a caseload of 5 and then 5 hours of supervision on top of it. And you have like 40 hours of reading on top of that, and like lecture. Like, it's not that you don't have work, but a lot of it is in service of this very finite goal. And then you go from a caseload of 5 to a caseload of 40 with 1 hour of supervision. And all of a sudden you just have like that professional development pieces that I don't know how to insulate that for you. And I think about like my own early career experiences, and I drove a lot at the time. And so I remember just crying in my car every day. Like, that's how I did it. I got in the car and I cried the whole way home. And I was talking to actually 2 of your coworkers about that not that long ago. And they're like, well, we never cry in our cars. And I'm like, well, maybe you should. Like,
It checks out.
have you tried just weeping uncontrolled, like snot, like give that a shot for a minute.
Good ugly cry.
I think it'll work. Give it a shot and see if that is helpful. And like, I'm joking about it and laughing. It was really painful and it worked. Like, I've developed a tolerance. I can sit with really painful stories and tolerate it and have some compartmentalization that comes with being a professional as long as I've been. And realize in that moment, this is painful to witness, but it's not happening to me.
Right.
This is your pain, and I will witness it and I won't look away because that's what you need. But also, when you leave my space, I'm not holding it anymore. I didn't put it on my shoulders and carry it forward. That's your pain to take with you, and I will hold it. I will like put a hand at your back to help you get there, but
Right.
I'm not picking it up. And I think earlier in my career, I picked it up and carried it a lot. I became responsible for my clients' outcomes a lot more than I am today. But I don't know how to get there without crying in your car.
Yeah, it's a hard lesson to learn.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't. I mean, I kept thinking, about this topic coming here today and how you really, what do they say? Can't see the trees when you're in the forest, or can't see the forest, whatever that saying is. It wasn't until time passed and looking back that I needed that introspection, but I didn't have it in the moment, especially like as a new nurse, as a new clinician, you're just trying to survive day to day. So
Getting through my shift.
I wish I had a suggestion for how to better do that. And I don't know. Like sometimes it really just does take maturing in your profession and taking the time to look back and realize like, oh, wow, I was experiencing some unhealthy, whether it be compassion fatigue or whatever. It's often very hard to realize that it's going on in the moment.
Yeah.
I think like learning to honor like the part of you that is a human that's experiencing the things versus like the part of you that's a professional that needs to. And so like the crying in your car is letting that human part of you experience like the loss and the grief and the hurt that your client is going through, even if the professional part of you knows like, I'm offering a hand to you to hold in this moment while you're in my office, and I'm going to let go and you're going to walk out and carry it with you. I'm not going to hold that for you. Like the human part of you still needs to grieve and process and learn how to set those boundaries and learn how to say, this is yours to carry, not mine. And that just takes, I think, a lot of really hard experience.
Yeah.
And I think mistakes, like carrying it when it wasn't yours to carry, over functioning. Like, it's interesting. I've worked with different supervisees over the years on not being like Superman, and it's always ironic to me because it's like, man, like it's like talking to yourself in a mirror.
Yeah, you're calling me out right now.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you're not a Superman. There's no it's impossible. But I think also some of that comes from making those mistakes, and I don't know how to support a supervisee through it and skip those pieces. I wish I could. Like, I wish there was a way that I could be like, all right, I'm going to take this part of my brain out. We're just going to install it in you. And you'll know that when you overfunction for a client, it literally never works long term. But I will always have the supervisee that is like, well, but what if this one is different? And it's like, it's not different, but try it. Test the hypothesis, report back. Tell me how it went. And then you come into my office crying, and it's like, okay, how'd it go? It's like, how did it go? Do you want to cry together? Do we want to scream into the void? Like, what do we need right now? But it's hard to find that space.
And I think in some ways, becoming a father helped me with that perspective.
Yes, it did.
Because
Why didn't you become a father?
Well, as a parent, you start to realize that sometimes no matter what you do, they're going to do the same thing. No matter how much you try to convince them that that's not a good idea, it's going to happen.
Gotta learn their own lessons.
And, looking back at my own life, there's plenty of lessons that I had to learn the hard way and wish I didn't, but I was stubborn and I had to. So I think, when I'm as a supervisor, I try to attend to those things and try to say, hey, here's a lesson that if you're smart, you're going to learn from my mistake, but you might have to make it yourself. And if you do, we'll talk about it, we'll process it, we'll talk about why that didn't work and why we shouldn't learn the lesson again and again. Try to learn it the first time. But sometimes I think for all of us, there's going to be some of those that we just repeat over and over again. And sometimes, with a client or even with supervisee, you're saying something and thinking in the back of that sounds like a good idea. Maybe I should try that. Yeah. Maybe I know what I'm talking about. I should implement that.
No, I think that another piece that had to settle in for me is respecting and honoring my client's own autonomy.
Yes.
And respecting and honoring that what worked for me in my story might not work for them in their story. And recognizing that they got to my office, right? Like they've lived through some stuff. I mean, most of my clients, when you like zoom out and look at their narratives, like if you were to just read their, biopic or autobiography, you would be like, holy cats, like how do you even wake up in the morning? And I think that's how I zoom out and really attend to the resiliency of my clients, because like, sure, you're hearing some voices that aren't there sometimes, or you're struggling with chronic suicidality, or you keep coming back to the same toxic relationship, or you keep using your same drug of choice, and it keeps taking you to that same place, and you still got here today. And man, if we change stories, if my shoes were your shoes, would I get here today? I don't know, And so sometimes just zooming out and looking at those really little things and honoring and believing in our clients' own resiliency. And I think, again, that's something that having my own kids have really helped me, like the resilience. I mean, even the process of childbirth, like the resiliency of the human body, like that's incredible. But to take it a step further, I've watched my kids overcome like some hard stuff in their very short life. I mean, 2020 was no picnic for anyone, and certainly not in our family. And so watching and witnessing resiliency in action to me is kind of where that secret sauce is. And then very intentionally practicing reckless optimism. Any drug and alcohol case, if I opened it, odds are statistically this isn't going to work out. And if I went in to my client and said like, hey, only about 10% of you never use again, what kind of therapist would I be? Like, how helpful would that be? I remember like looking around the room and being like, only 10% of these clients, statistically speaking, are going to live well 2 years from now. And I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't get to know which ones. I don't get to know who to invest in and who to be like, well, you've got 3 more rehabs in ya. Call me when you're ready. We don't get to know that. And so I have to choose to believe in a positive outcome, even when a positive outcome seems pretty impossible.
I always try to believe, well, I think I do believe, whether it's pride or whatever, I'm going to see a successful discharge for this client. Mm-hmm. Even if it seems hopeless at the moment.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know how I'm going to get there, but I'm going to get there.
How do you do that? What do you lean on for that?
I think some of it is kind of denial in a sense.
Yeah.
That
Willing suspension of disbelief.
Yeah, that I'm going to do everything in my power as long as they're showing up to get them to this point. I trust the process of therapy. I think that's a big piece of it. So I trust that if this person keeps showing up and we keep doing what we need to do, we're going to get there. Now, I also recognize I can't make that person do that.
For sure.
I can't make them follow instructions. I can't make them be compliant with medications, or, I can't make them not leave AMA. Mm-hmm. But that's where that perspective as parent of, they have their own autonomy. They're going to make their own choices. I would like them to make healthy choices, but sometimes they're going to make self-destructive ones.
Absolutely.
And I can't do anything about that.
I think the trust the process piece, and it always feels like this amorphous, like, I don't know. I can't imagine myself ever looking at somebody and being like, just trust the process. Because I think they might punch me in the face, and they probably should at that point in time. But ultimately, like, I believe in the model. Mm-hmm. I believe in the therapy we do. I rely on a model. So whenever I'm doing therapy, I'm drawing from a theoretical orientation. I'm drawing from a background that I'm leaning into. I imagine in the physical health world, you're like, when X happens, you do Y, and you have a certain set of guidelines and criteria as your map or your guidepost. And so I think even in those darkest days, in those, I love the song from Frozen 2, The Next Right Thing. Mm-hmm. Go home, listen to it. It's a great song to ugly cry to. But it's all about, like, when everything feels so dark, you just take the next step. And I think in the therapeutic work that we do, you fall back on the model. You say, this is the theory that I'm using to inform our practice. And I'm going to do the next right thing. And my hope is that we'll, baby step? What about Bob? We'll baby step our way into that sustained recovery. But we've got to kind of believe in it a little bit. So is anything left unsaid before we draw this conversation to a close? All right. Well, hearing nothing, I want to thank you guys for joining me here today, tackling this extremely difficult topic. I want to thank everybody at home for listening throughout this conversation here today. As usual, if you need to get in touch with me for anything at all, Kim at howtobehappyhour.com is a great way to submit questions, ideas, comments for my PCS staff. If you want to volunteer to join a panel, please reach out. We've got a couple of really great topics coming up that I'm looking forward to filming. And thank you all again. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.